are live.
This is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025, 9 o'clock in the morning. The committee is discussing H129, which is I call it the very good outline for a school construction bill. We have with us Budget Council and Joint Fiscal Office folks to answer our questions. And we didn't get a chance to get into a lot of questioning yesterday, but I'm going to start. So this is a conversation that I've had a couple times, but I thought it'd be good for the whole committee. So the question is, do we have? I often have thought when we look at the Rhode Island model and Massachusetts and how different states do school construction. Some, like in Massachusetts, they put a penny on the sales tax, and that money is devoted to school construction. I think Rhode Island does an appropriation out of the state budget. And so I thought we could have talked about the advantages and disadvantages of both, because that's kind of a big policy point to come up with something. Anyway, so I'm going to turn over to you all, and especially to you, Chris, and just to answer the question of what are the pros and cons of a designated income stream or funding stream versus saying, because this bill says that the money goes to a special fund, but it's in the annual budget of the governor. Correct.
Yeah. Sure. So good morning, everyone. For the record, Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office. I gave a slide deck to this committee a few weeks ago that probably feels like ancient history at this point, because days feel like weeks around here. But I want to reiterate some of the items that I talked about in the sort of broader context of funding considerations for school construction. So I didn't follow all of your conversation yesterday, but I did follow enough of it to prompt me to show up here at 9 o'clock just to be around to answer some questions. So feel free to repeat any questions I might have missed, but I wanted to start with what you asked, Mr. Chair. And I think the draft that you see contemplates that there would be funding through the governor's budget process for school construction. And the language would direct the Agency of Education to submit a school construction funding request as part of the budget process to develop what we call the GovRec budget. The thinking behind that is, it is very difficult to reopen the budget once it's been developed to try to put a very, very big ticket cost like school construction in there. It's much easier to get things like this considered on the front end of the budget development process. When you see the budget every year, there is an entire section called the D section that moves money between funds. We call them transfers. That's the technical term for it. So you'll see a whole list of items where you can transfer, millions of dollars from the general fund to some special fund and vice versa. The thinking behind the draft that you all have seen in H129 is that this funding request would mechanically operate similar to that. Why that is advantageous is the number one tool that the legislature has for setting priorities for the state is the appropriations process, the budget development process. That is when you all vote on how you're going to spend the money every year in response to evolving needs and priorities and economic conditions. Whenever you when you take revenue sources and dedicate them for specific priorities, you're essentially getting ahead of that process and that priority setting process. And that may make sense in the minds of people who are championing a particular priority or activity, but I work for the legislative branch, so like one of my uncomfortable tasks sometimes coming in to committees and reminding them of sort of what the big picture is. I think one of the real downsides to creating a dedicated revenue stream to fund any priority is that you're creating distance from the appropriations process. You can hinder the legislature's ability to see the full picture and effectively set priorities. It is very easy, and this is not a knock on the appropriations committees, but it's easier to sort of overlook the things that have funds dedicated to it and focus on other things that go through the general fund. That isn't always advantageous to the program that you're trying to support. It is desirable in many cases to be able to have an audience before the appropriations committees. So a program can articulate what they're doing with money, whether what they're getting is sufficient or not, what's coming down the pipeline, so legislators can plan for that. Another pitfall to having a dedicated revenue source is that dedicated revenue stream might not keep up with the needs of a program. Many of our revenue streams are stagnant or declining. We try to mitigate that volatility across the entire budget by having a diverse range of revenue sources flow into the three major funds and then get appropriated or transferred out by the legislature. Another reason why that's important is because the revenue forecast that we build the budget around focuses on the money that goes through the three major funds. It does not capture all of the dedicated revenue streams that go into different special funds throughout the government. So from a managerial and accounting perspective, it can create a lot of challenges when you split up revenue streams and say, 3% of this goes here or 5% of this goes here. It's a lot cleaner to track, get a good sense of the full picture from the appropriations perspective if all of the money is going through the revenue forecast into those three major funds, and then people have a holistic view of the picture and then can make priority decisions. That's sort of my long rambling answer of why I would just caution legislators about dedicating revenue streams. There are times and places where it makes sense, but not everything that comes up necessarily makes sense for that. My job here is to try to remind legislators, regardless of what committee they're on or what party they belong to, of sort of the big picture and trying to protect legislative prerogatives, because I work for the branch. So that's why I feel that it's very important to just remind everybody to try to preserve the integrity of the appropriations process, because sometimes you might think that you're advantaging or protecting a program by dedicating a revenue stream to it and sort of putting it ahead and getting it out of that prioritization mix. But there can be some real unintended consequences with that as well because of that distance you're creating from the process. So that is my long rambling answer. I don't know if I clarified anything from it, but I'm happy to answer any follow-ups you might have.
Thank you. I mean, it is a philosophical debate.
Absolutely.
If you look at what our most recent history with after school and childcare, both are dedicated revenue streams dedicated to a certain programmatic area.
And I would say those are
that-
some of the
that-
recent exceptions.
Was that?
I would say those are some of the prominent recent exceptions to what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yes, but they're not, I mean, but you would make the same argument for those.
I would. I think childcare was a little bit different because it was an entitlement program you're creating with a dedicated revenue stream. And we did have to find a way to build that into the revenue forecast. It was an add-on. And one of the ways we were able to do that is because some of that money is being collected through personal income tax returns. So it was a little bit easier to sort of parse it out. But on the back end, it has been a challenge from an accounting and tracking perspective.
Sure, I forgot, it's an entitlement program.
It is.
So it has
It's
to
a little bit different, yeah. And I'm not saying what I'm saying here is a hard and fast rule. There are exceptions, but I would just caution people that this isn't necessarily the first tool you need to reach for. There are other considerations involved as well.
questions. And so now let's just sort of open it up to the whole bill that we had the explanation of yesterday. I'm going to just suggest some policy points that we have to think about. Chris just went through one. Another would be how do we deal with projects sort of in the pipeline? How do we, we have this issue of, do we hold people back until the program is in place, even if the program won't be in place for 5 years? There are some big needs out there, and there may be some big ideas that fall within what we'd like to see. So that's just something to think about. You could say that the program will look back 2 years at any bond that is approved. Something about it. And I suspect that makes things a little more challenging too, just in terms of if you don't have the money to live up to that agreement, with the budgetary appropriation, what happens? So anyway,
Just for
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead,
clarification,
please.
so you're talking about, so this has to get stood up and implemented, this program. But if somebody were to move forward with their own construction project in the meantime, they have a certain time limit to look back and possibly fold them into the program. So we.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
They
So
might get some help, that they might get some help.
we always bring up the example of Woodstock. Woodstock is shovel ready. And they may be sitting there going, well, we're not gonna move forward with a bond proposal until we know what the legislature is going to do, so that we don't miss out on a potential bonus here.
So I have a quick question about Woodstock. Part of their hesitation about the bond, and again, what does that raise? It raises some limit for them that they're gonna get penalized? What?
That's another policy point we gotta talk about.
Right.
Sorry, guys.
No, that's a great point.
Yeah, okay.
So,
If you could just explain that to me.
yes, so if Woodstock were to pass a bond tomorrow.
Right.
Their bond payments before that would put them over the excess spending threshold, because we used to exempt bond payments from
should.
the excess spending threshold calculation.
Right.
We don't anymore.
Seems like we should.
So that's another policy. point to think about.
These are all things that were discussed.
Yeah.
Over the summer, in our working group.
Okay.
We just did not have the time and the capacity.
To put that into play,
make Those types of decisions.
right?
Yeah, so that's why.
That seems
Why
like,
we're here, yeah.
and again, I'm naive, that just seems like a no-brainer.
So thanks for bringing that up and for every Woodstock, there's plenty of school districts who have bonds out there who actually, when they did their bond, expected they were gonna not meet the excess spending threshold, not be included in the excess spending threshold. So, you know, there's exceptions to every rule, and I would caution us about even considering without full impact, considering looking back if we're moving forward with a school construction bill, because there are as we talked about yesterday, and as you folks worked on, there are going to be very specific criteria around what gets approved and what doesn't get approved. And if something's already been approved, the bill's, you know, the construction's already started, whatever, that doesn't fall into that category. So I'm not saying this has anything to do with Woodstock or anything else, but I'm just saying this is going to take a pot of real deep thought, because this could have wide ranging impacts. And again, my heart goes out to the folks around Woodstock who are trying very hard to do it, but for every Woodstock, there's 5 more school districts right now who maybe aren't shovel ready, as Chair called them, but are ready, you know, and they would fit the same criteria. And it's really tough.
And it is not just Woodstock.
No, it isn't. Yeah,
So they're gonna move ahead.
the bond passed.
Okay.
And school districts in my region literally for years have been exempting the construction bond from excess spending threshold. When that got taken away, we just went flying over the excess spending threshold this year.
And how severe is the penalty for something like that?
All right, so maybe with
Every dollar we
you
raise.
helping and John jumping in where necessary, let's create a list.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sort of decision points that we have to make, but I'll bet there's already. Would
I
you
like
like
the
to
list.
just sort of walk us through those?
Yes, so the letter that accompanied the bill, Annie, is that posted?
I was just gonna say,
I
did we
have-
see it?
Thank you. Lists,
Yeah.
so we concluded our work with hopefully a very clear list of exactly what we knew were unresolved questions or things that larger committees were gonna need to decide. I can wait till it's up. There's some large categories.
It's-
Posted.
Yep.
Done.
For me. Did you get it?
Just wait a minute. I'm not, I'm just kidding.
I just thought you sat back, so I thought maybe you had.
If you go to my name under witness instead of today's date,
Oh.
you can get it that way. Because apparently it was originally posted January 16th, so. You're searching
Letter from state.
letter
aid.
from the state aid
There
or
it
school
is.
construction working group.
Sorry, it seems that you were trying to.
Is it, are these the same two, the one that says H129 and the one that doesn't say H129? They're the same thing.
Actually, that won't work, Karen. It says, sorry.
the
it
next
says-
One doesn't
Scroll
work,
down
one
a little
might go
further.
work.
Go back, no, go back. Go back
This
to the
is like
screen with her
Yeah.
I
documents.
love
But we do need to have
Scroll
our
down.
committee website walkthrough at some. point.
See, go to the second one, the other heading. There you go. The lower one.
Got it.
Yes.
Why?
The first one's a no-go and that one's a good one.
Letter.
Okay,
It wasn't coming up for me.
yeah.
Okay,
So we can jump right to unresolved questions and issues. and have
There we
fun.
go. Lovely.
Hi. There's a few.
I may just for our
Please.
witnesses time. Chris, I'm not sure if we have any other questions for you, so if you have other things you need to do, that's fine.
Just reach out if you need anything.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
all right, unresolved questions or issues, as we were just talking, the look back, or, you know, how do we deal with the time keeps moving
As you go
forward,
ahead,
decisions
right.
have to be made. There's reference, so that's clearly a decision point. There's reference in the bill, this is something that AOE can talk much more about 21st century standards for school
Mhm.
facilities.
Mhm.
If we want to go down that line and use some of this language, they offered that they could provide more expertise or testimony around what that is. So there's, some of these are policy things, some of these are funding things. Emergency facilities funding, this wouldn't necessarily have to be in this bill, I don't think, but it was raised repeatedly from the agency as a pretty dire issue that we currently have 50,000 was my recollection,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
50,000 annually that the AOE can use for emergency facilities funding issues. And that threshold is quite low, given what is happening often on the ground. There's in statute, something about it cannot be because of deferred maintenance. It's becoming a harder thing to parse out, but there's a potentially direct tie to loss in classroom, in-person school days, so. And the longer we wait to get construction going, obviously the bigger this issue becomes, so.
On that note, I would just ask the committee's assistance here. We will have AOE in at some point to just present their annual budget, the operating budget for the AOE. If somebody could remember to ask them, hey, you have brought this up as an issue, how come, or thank you for adding more, or why haven't you added more to this amount? Whoever.
As we were just talking, the excess spending threshold, the way that that is operating. Again, that's outside this bill potentially, but a very direct tie to decision-making around facilities projects. So the first page are really things that are maybe outside the bill, but related. The next page is the more direct things. How much, this again, I guess goes back to AOE, how many people it would take to actually run the program. The rough estimate we got was 3 FTEs. And then would that be supported by the administration to add those staff people at the AOE to do the work? As we, yeah.
Question, do you mind if I?
Yeah, please, yeah, consider this an open discussion.
Okay, thank you. Do we know did you guys find out how many people were employed during the previous? 'Cause
It was
I think
small.
there's One and.
It was, yeah, like
I don't even know if they
between
were
1
two
and
full.
2. I don't know if it was 2
Yeah.
full or 1 and a partial. I think is roughly about where we were. And I honestly think we were relying mostly on Representative Emmons' institutional knowledge. The AOE wasn't, those working on it now were so far away from when that existed, weren't even
Well, having used them
Sure.
myself
Yes,
quite a number of
Yes.
times, I don't remember two full-time.
yeah, it sounded like it was between 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you. That helps put it.
One of the goals here, and this is sort of stolen from Rhode Island, but is to have enough people at AOE, so they are on the ground, really
Right.
walking through the process with a community that's might be putting forth a bond.
And it sounded like in the way back times that existed to an
It-
extent.
It did,
There was some on the ground.
yes.
And I guess we should note, we do know that even in this interim, AOE is still somewhat involved in the process in that projects, like I know Colchester, it's a large $100 million bond, did get like a desk review. There's no sort of formal thing, but did go through all the processes at AOE so that it was potential, go back to page 1, for if A changes later on, but they had things looked at, approved. I don't even know what they were within working with AOE and get it in that.
May I jump in?
Yeah,
Please.
John Gray, Office of Head of Council. On that piece, there was legislation, I think it passed back in 2009. So the moratorium had just been recently imposed and there was concern about, in particular, the excess spending cap. And so a process was introduced to essentially allow school districts to continue to make a preliminary application, not under the condition they would receive any particular aid, but to ensure that their costs were considered approved costs and would therefore be excluded from their excess spending cap. So it could be rooted down a different path. And because that continued post-moratorium, I don't know the extent to which it's continued to this day. There has been some continued contact between districts and the AOE, even beyond the position of the moratorium.
Thanks for that reminder.
So there's the AOE budget and personnel piece. The next big chunk header here, advisory council's role and purpose. We started to pick at this yesterday. This is a hugely undefined or up in the air decision here about if we're moving rulemaking and kind of process to the AOE on this, which that's what's in the bill, but doesn't mean that has to be the course we go. Who else is looking at, if we're talking about an office of up to 3 people at AOE, but we're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars and a lot of bonding capacity and an impact statewide in education spending. Who else is sort of looking that statewide view of how we are prioritizing, staggering, what the capacity is, what's happening in one place, how that might impact another? There's this sort of rough idea of an advisory council, but I think that needs much more work.
Just a quick question
Yeah.
about the advisory council. I believe that was potentially put in place because of rulemaking moving to the AOE, am I right? But
Yes, and it was partially trying, again, kind of building off the Rhode Island model. There is,
Oh,
I'm trying to remember what their group exactly is and how they functioned, but they have a kind of some sort of small group that is professional, that is the intermediary between a project being approved and actually being funded.
And the first proposal that came through that was presented to us had them having the gatekeeping to the
Yes.
rule making. So they were the yes or no. AOE would come up with a rule, they would propose it to the committee and the committee would have the yes or no ability on the rule.
so they had,
So they had gatekeeping. That's how it came to us. And then as we worked through it, it kind of landed the way it is, but that's still a discussion point.
and rulemaking there was in the AOE.
Rulemaking was in the AOA, but this committee had the ability to say yes or no.
The bill in front of us has the advisory authority not.
Not making
This
the,
is
yeah,
how it
I understand.
landed, But it
Right.
originally came to us without ability.
But the context we're operating in today, February, whatever, of a big other education transformation proposal that contemplates all rulemaking related to
Yeah.
education moving to the AOE. That was not on the, so we're operating in pretty
The new
different context
territory.
right now.
Yeah.
That decision hasn't been made either, so there's, again, these questions about what decisions have to come
So
first.
I guess my
Yeah.
question was just to get at because I have serious concerns about moving rulemaking. Everybody's going to say it to AOE. if we were continue rulemaking, if the state board, how would that change the role? I'm not asking you to answer this,
Yeah.
but how would that change the role? That's one of the questions we need to answer, whether we even need an advisory committee, or if we do, what would their role be? That's all, because, still, that's a concern.
I would say as my feeling, as we sort of watered down the advisory council's role, we started to wrestle with
Right.
that, like, wait,
Yeah.
what do they do? Is this sort of unnecessary and extra? But on the flip side, we feel like we need something because we put so much power and authority in the AOE here.
Yeah.
So that was very
Got it.
much what we were running into.
Thank you.
I would encourage you guys to think holistically about that particular problem. So if you start to put in statute particular conditions, so like if you built out those bonus incentives or particular priorities, at that point, it kind of changes the calculus about how you think about the advisory board and how you think about how much discretion you're granting to the agency. Because if you codify particular pieces that you think are especially important, that may remove some of the concern about, are they out on their own, just operating this program entirely as they see fit. So there's ways to address it even beyond the advisory board. You have the opportunity as well in statute to specify particular things that you want to take out of the rulemaking process and say, we take a stand on these particular issues. Does that make sense?
No.
The next category, next bucket here is maybe the biggest. That's the actual kind of meat of the program, which is what are we prioritizing, and then what are we even further incentivizing, and to what extent and for how long. We have work from the previous working group already that sort of outlined some ideas for this. We have work from Rhode Island and how they have done this. We had some initial proposals from AOE and what some of these different, how these might stack up. We struggled quite a bit with how to actually nail down sort of numbers or percentages absent knowing how much funding, if any, was available. So I think we eventually decided it was okay to leave this undecided, since it would matter almost wholly based on what kind of funding is available. And then add on top of that, how our system is operating as we consider transformation. I think we were and did try to be quite clear, and there was pretty broad consensus in the working group around, the intent section, or the statement of policy was pretty carefully crafted. And there was, I think, a clear intent from those of us in the working group that this program is intended, especially in the initial phase, if we can find the funding, to really incentivize the future state we need to and want to move to for schools, of operating more at scale, of consolidating. And that's somewhat laid out in the statement of policy. But there's a real challenge here, and that there's so much need that how to balance just a project that needs to happen to keep a school functioning versus one that is more strategic and along these incentives is going to be a tough trade-off to weigh.
The bill says that the advisory group is really charged with coming up with the incentives. Is that correct?
So I would go back to they are meant to be purely advisory. I think you're right to identify that one of the listed subdivision pieces calls out in particular development of those priorities. So the reason I believe that the group included that there is the agency would be developing the priorities through rulemaking, but wanted to make clear that this is kind of a key role that the advisory board is meant to undertake. And I think this focus on both bonus incentives and priorities was a particular piece where there was concern that the AOE not operate independently. You can imagine them undertaking rulemaking on tons of technical matters, the sorts of things that are already in existing Series 6000. Wanted to call out specifically that these pieces, prioritization and the like, are key pieces that the advisory board should inform on. And I thought a little bit more about your question yesterday about strong advisory versus weak advisory. I think a better way to characterize it, and I know that I was the one who used the word strong, is maybe how language constrains folks. How easily can someone meet the conditions in law? How easily can they check and say, I've satisfied subdivision A? if you have relatively generic language and you don't spell things out, it's easy to satisfy a particular condition. But the more prescriptive you can be, the more sets of responsibilities you identify, like calling out priorities as a particular piece of rulemaking, the more you can strain and ensure that that advisory role addresses particular issues. Because if you just had a subdivision, for instance, that said advisory board is to advise on rulemaking, they can satisfy that by advising on rulemaking as they see fit. But if you call out in particular rulemaking on these pieces, it makes clear that these are places of particular input that you need stronger consideration. And it's worth noting also, I realize rulemaking does cause people to shake their heads and react strongly. All of this would go through a formal rulemaking process nonetheless. This is just the start of that piece. You still have the formal procedure that every rulemaking goes through currently.
On the question of rulemaking and who does it, we will have State Board of Education folks in here. We can actually turn their attention to this proposal as well.
Yeah, great.
We had just brief testimony from them during the process that they haven't been doing it for a long time because the aid hasn't existed. Clearly, their workload is pretty large. I would put it back into this rising concern of what does the state board do? What does the agency do? How do they interact? Who has what power? Who has the resources to execute that work?
Yes, and I would definitely,
That's becoming a
what I would say,
rising.
if we were to put all of this on the state board,
We've gotta
money's gotta go with it.
Done.
And I think it's worth drawing out one thing that's a difference between what's currently on the books and this proposal. On the books, there's a reference to the state board vision for education, essentially as informing. That's not part of this process, and I think that the reason it could end up being, but part of why it's not included in this initial proposal is the view was that there wasn't the capacity, or at least the appetite up to this point, to develop that fulsome vision of education that could guide the program.
It speaks to the real context and challenges we're in right now that we have. We're going to hear from the state board later today. You know, we have the agency doing a lot of big picture thinking and work with the transformation proposal. And we have the body that we created last session, the Commission on the Future of Public Education, which we're also going to hear from today, which in the absence of vision and strong leadership was our solution, at least at the time, to that. So now we have multiple entity, you know, I think we have some things to work out and consider about who's doing what, who's leading, who's driving the bus here, you know, vision, the execution of work.
All the while waiting to see what the next shoe is to drop from the federal level.
Exactly. So, yeah. And then lastly, it's not on the list, but we had in the enabling legislation for this listed 10,000 groups that were supposed to be also part of our process. Lesson to selves and how we write legislation. When we had 6 meetings, we could have we really tried to focus on essentially just within the legislators and with Leg Council and JFO as needed, the policy decisions we were trying to make, and know that we would need much more feedback from all of the organizations and perspectives that were listed in the enabling legislation. And that was a serious shortcoming of our work. So as we produce, if we produce a bill and work on a bill here, obviously we will need to have that kind of stakeholder engagement here in the committee process. So there's we could start on any one of those
Well,
things.
that's what I was
I know.
going, which one we should take
Where
on
do we
first?
go?
Thoughts? Anybody have, like, we've got some simple questions like, they aren't simple, but do we remove or what do we put back in the exemption of capital spending from the excess spending threshold? Now this is all sort of like thought thinking and tinkering within the system that we currently have, and
Right.
we're also having big conversations about transforming the way we do education. So an excess spending threshold may not be something that even is a concept anymore.
Why was it included in the excess?
So it had always been exempt, and then when we reinstituted the excess spending threshold 2 years ago or last year, it was essentially to say this group was working on this proposal. Let's hold it, and we're talking about doing a big view of school construction. So let's just sort of disincentivize people moving forward until we have a better statewide vision.
So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel by reversing.
Correct.
It was just tapping the brakes,
It was just what?
tapping the brakes.
Tapping the brakes.
Slow down. All right.
But it didn't, I mean, to be fair, it didn't look bad. And that was where the problem was. It didn't tap the brakes for all those people who had bonds that they 20-year bonds that they were
Right.
paying on. So it was, this is not, it's just, it was a heavy burden on some
Yes.
districts where who were not even slightly considering asking for more because they couldn't afford
That
it.
is that is a important part of that chapter.
And, that's a decision, I think that it's a Ways and Means, or it's certainly we need Ways and Means and JFO's help on,
Yes.
we had mostly
And frankly,
Chris's help from JFO and understanding the bigger picture of how the whole budget works. We did not get into the weeds with like Julia Richter and the ed fund. And, when you make one decision one place, how does that impact everywhere else within our statewide ed fund? Also knowing there's a discussion about changing that. So those are,
I guess for me, that would be my concern is if, and again, I don't know the
Yeah.
information, if we do exempt it again from excess spending threshold, what impact does that have statewide? Not just for that particular school.
It's important that everybody understands what excess spending threshold is. I hope we all do, because I'm not sure everybody, I'm shocked at how many times people don't understand what the excess spending threshold really is, which is every dollar you spend over the excess spending threshold, you tax twice, $2. And that's just really
Big deal.
huge burden on our taxpayers. And some that schools can't control.
So
Like excess.
are you saying that there are actually a bunch of schools that took that penalty because they just needed a school building?
I'm saying that there are school districts who are dealing with that excess spending threshold now because they had a bond they passed 10 years ago or 15 years ago and they're still paying.
And they were
that's
penalized.
what had always been exempted until this last year when we removed the exemption. And there was no new spending necessary.
And just for the group's benefit, there's two things we're kind of talking about in
Yeah.
this area. There's a suspension of
Yeah.
the excess spending penalty, which was initially in place through 2029. And then that was repealed effective this July
Yeah.
in last year's yield bill, but
Mhm.
also additionally in the definition of excess spending. So the things that actually pick you above the threshold and subject you to the penalty,
Right.
there had been an exclusion for bond payments approved prior to a
Prior.
particular date. So there's two things. There's suspension of the excess spending. There's also exclusions. That's your kind of look back.
which is why it's helpful every time we're having all the foundation formula discussions. And though that decision may largely be more in Ways and Means, the interplay with school construction was really important. And I think we heard from APA yesterday, again, they're modeling essentially a future state for school construction. Or any sort of major facilities work outside of general operations and maintenance happens outside of your foundation formula, your kind of normal operating budget. It's in some other place or mechanism in your statewide funding.
I would
Right.
call it an undefined or
That-
yet to be defined mechanism.
Right, but that's a huge distinction.
That's right. And I think that's an important
That's so different from how we operate now if it's within the ed fund.
the foundation costs, to the extent that they incorporate any maintenance costs, as I understand it, based on the testimony that I've heard, are just about ongoing, like regular maintenance that you
Yes,
expect if you
that's
have an operating facility. But otherwise, school construction is not related to the proposal. So it would be outside.
Which is starting to feel more and more like it can't do one without knowing our plan on the other.
And it's sort of counter to our overall goal.
I don't want to speak too strongly on this piece, but you can craft an ideal program in the absence of knowing what the funding will be, just to say that you want to incentivize particular projects and to caution some of the, I would call misunderstandings I've heard when I hear people talk about different percentages and levels of aid that you would provide. People will hesitate and say, well, we don't want to apply 100% funding because that's going to put the state on the hook for so much. That's not the way that it would work. The way that it would work is you have an available pool of money and then you would just fund less projects if you prioritize to 100%. So just a caution that you can set this up in a way where you talk about the kinds of projects you want to incentivize and still not know where the funding is gonna be. That's a key part, but you can.
Can I just,
Which I think is mostly what we were trying to do in this bill, so
Mhm.
you're helping guiding us to the next
Yeah.
step of that to get even closer to creating the program that is ready to turn on.
so it could also be different percentages for different types of
Exactly.
construction aid.
Exactly, and that would be one of the great policy levers you can do to push.
We did do that.
projects.
It used to be 50%
Right.
for merging and 30% for others approved.
Okay. As we try to get our agendas put together here, I think, we'll have to think about what on here. I guess I would say, I would like to send the excess spending threshold exemption question over to Ways and Means to discuss when they have time, and have us. Probably we need to focus in on the working group, what its role is, and how much power it has or doesn't have, and who should be on it.
Advisory,
The advisory, yep.
I would agree, except I'm, based on what you've been saying a little bit this morning, John, and making me think about if we could come to some consensus about what kind of projects we want to incentivize, or at least we could just put some of that into statute.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that might be a faster, like, the challenge, the thing I think I worry about is we're creating another group to make the decisions. That felt a little bit like our challenge even in this past working group, was like, okay, so we're again gonna like prepare the next group to make the decisions, like when do we just make the decisions? This is
Yeah.
what we will fund and this is what we won't. And so in the amount of swirl we're existing in right now, part of me is more inclined to go
Okay, so.
let's make some of those decisions.
All right, so let's, I think that's great. So let's say we are going down that path.
Yeah.
Who do we need in front of us
Yeah,
to
that's it.
provide us with information? I mean, we've talked about this now for 3 years, so maybe we don't
So I
need
think-
anybody. Maybe we can just dive right into
We need,
it.
I mean,
He would he be?
I think, so Bob Donahue's at AOE and working kind of on in their facilities team. Yes,
But it's,
I think we need the field, what level of the field, I suppose it's superintendent, it's superintendents or school boards. Again, this feels more precarious in the other conversation we're having. Makes me think perhaps superintendents have a bit more. We're like, if we're moving towards fewer boards somehow, some way, I wonder if superintendents have a more clear view of.
well, we can certainly,
I don't-
since there's been, changeover in leadership there. But however, I assume that they have previous testimony that they can come in and review with us on this issue.
And I would offer that the goal setting piece of this is a classically legislative task.
Sure is.
What sorts of things you want to do.
Yeah.
There would then be empirical questions that inform that, like it may be that you don't want to have this funding percentage for energy saving types of projects because of the impact it might have on school construction across the state. But just thinking about the kinds of things you want to push toward is a classically legislative task. And I would
I think that's what we should do.
suggest that don't just let people come in and tell you the models that they've used. You can decide.
I think probably with us reviewing some of what we've heard and maybe even going back to some other rounds, we might just want to dig in within the committee.
Yep.
And it may be helpful to look at that task force report when you think about this.
Right. The previous.
Mhm. Yep.
All right, well, when we can, we will make room for that as soon as possible. We are challenged.
Yeah.
We are challenged with moving pieces way up here that we may or may not have control over, moving pieces here that we have some control over. And we are talking in today's context. Sometimes we need to be talking in a future context.
Yeah.
We all just need to sort of figure out how we're gonna move about.
And there's an extraordinary challenge in the field right now, like trying to get that sort of help from the superintendents or whatever group it is of, one, they are absolutely, barely above water of our statewide conversations about what may or may not happen fairly quickly here in terms of transformation. And then they are, literally just being inundated on an hourly basis from the federal level with executive orders. This might happen, this might not happen, and things they have to deal with. So it's going to challenge, I think, our ability to get as, not by reality, that kind of precise feedback.
And to a certain extent, we're gonna need to just close the door, close the windows,
Yeah, and
seal
just-
out the outside world and to be public, but just
Right.
in our minds and just say, we're gonna work on this and not bring in everything else that scares the bejesus out of us. Ross?
I just want to say is just from a new person's point of view, you guys have been working on this for years. I think you probably have the knowledge to make this happen. I really do.
I mean, we've had lots of testimony over a long period of time, and you're probably right. We can make a lot of these decisions right here, right
You
now.
know what the ideal system is.
And we were on the edge of those too, but it does
Yep.
feel like, okay, at some point, we cannot create the next group to make the decisions. Let's just make.
Yeah,
Somebody-
that's
somebody
just kicking
at
the
some point
can.
has to make it.
Right.
Yeah. that's-
I have a very decisive person, and
I know.
I really believe in pushing it off on other people.
No, 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 no.
So everybody will need to help bring me in on
Nope.
it.
That's on the